you look at sort of the venerable Keynesians in Cambridge, they've all been cleared off, to land economy or management or wherever. So that part of that is kind of academic political, that they've been shifted off, they've been cleared off the ground, as it were. But I think there's also, you have to say, well, in all these cases, media, NGOs, academia, there has to be an appetite to try and go into these questions and say, okay, well, we don't agree not only with the way you're framing questions, but we certainly don't agree with the answers you're giving. So here is how we frame those questions.
And if you shift from the ethnic cleansing of economics to the appetite of the non-economists, I mean, it seemed to me that was why there was such a fuss about your columns, was that it seemed to suggest that people were, kind of inwardly focused on a kind of rephized kind of profession of small groups of people talking to themselves. Is that unfair?
What I found really interesting about writing those pieces is I've got a friend who's actually just coming up to Manchester University to the sociology faculty here, but she was teaching at the LSE at the time. She asked me to come along and sit on a panel about sociology in the crisis. And I gave this talk, which I basically made some kind of argument like that. And sociologists there were all pretty engaged. In fact, you got very interesting way of comeback. These were sort of PhD, people doing the last year of their PhD. And they were all sort of quite engaged by the thing. And I thought, well, if they're interested, then maybe, maybe I'll get away writing a column about sociologists or academics in the crisis, which is not the sort of thing, to go back to your point about lost in showbiz and all the rest of it, it's not the sort of thing you can normally get past an editor. So I said, I'd like to write a piece. And what I found really interesting was, publicly, there was a huge amount of opposition from, there was such a level of opposition. The letters editor sits there, and I normally sit here, so they're desk in front of me. And they were actually pissing themselves laughing about the amount of posts they got from people saying there isn't a problem here, which, obviously, if you want to show that there's not a problem, the last thing you do is get droves of people saying there's really not a problem here. And the thing I found really interesting is, on one hand, you've got that public response, which is, yes, actually you're completely wrong. We are still maintaining our side of the contract with the public. We still deliver on our promise. We still do all sorts of things, not just do with financial crisis, but all across the piece. And then privately, I was getting even more response, which was all, this is, actually, you're on something here, that there is a real problem here. And what really struck me was, some of the people who were writing the public response saying that I was completely wrong were in private, sending me letters saying, actually, I totally agree with you. So what was I meant to do that as a response? But I suppose you've split them out. You've said media, NGOs, and academia. I tend to see those three. There is a lack of a healthy conversation going on at all three levels, which ought to be more joined up, which is the only way, surely, that you get to reframe some of these questions.
Sure. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think that's, if one might be allowed to make a plug. I think that's one of the things that makes your column interesting, is that you are reading academic stuff and coming to terms with it. As indeed in his heyday, when, if you remember the early 90s, which you probably don't, when Will Hutton was economics editor of the Guardian, he'd read one or two things every week.
Yeah.
It was always, input and response. But this would be a good point, I think, when you point out the way in which your columns hilariously divided academe and led to those pompous letters into the letters editor, and also the people saying good on you, to bring the audience in.
Yeah.
You've got a question for the audience?
Yes, so Carol basically has asked me 3 questions, and asked me to come up with a question for you. And I really wanted to just to go back and sort of pick up on this last point, which is really, just to be sort of very clear, in those pieces that I was writing, I was always very sort of, I hope, sort of clear that I thought that non-economists had a lot to say about, the economic crisis and the crisis in economics. And so what I'm wondering is, where is it? Is it just that I've missed it? Is it that there's loads of stuff about to happen? Or is it, what else is going on?
Well, that's fair enough. Yeah. Can we, Iron in the back? We should say some people have exemplary records of engagement, and Iron is one of them. Yes, elite interviews with finance and politics.
I feel like reversing the question, because even if it did exist, I mean, the question that always strikes me is, even if it does exist, and clearly there are lots of examples in this room of it existing,
Yeah.
how come it doesn't get into the mainstream? How come Will Hutton or you or CRESC or whoever else, or Chang or several other people, or Krugman can write these things and it not filter through to the mainstream debate about politics and economics? And perhaps that is the barrier. Why isn't it getting into there? If it does exist, maybe that's also the terror. So I guess that's a media question. Well, the movement, maybe it will find its way into economic commentary, but not into the political debate. That won't cross the bridge, perhaps.
Can we take a few more from the floor? Yes.
Well, I mean, my
Wait a second. Elizabeth Pivanelli.
Well, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I'm just going to say that actually the same thing. It seems to me that even if we look at one of the most supposedly rarefied domains of the academy, critical theory, it's been doing almost nothing over the last 20 years other than critically examining the reorganization of the relationship between, and again, it's in their language, life and power, and critiquing the neoliberal approach to markets and society. Now, it might not be in a language that that many people find, quote, accessible, and it might be because the kind of thinking that's attempting to be done there demands a different kind of vocabulary. But it's absolutely being done. It was being done prior to the crisis of 2008. It never thought the economy was okay and the banking system was okay in 2006, nor does it continue to think so. Although you're right, I don't think anybody quite knows what this thing is that we still call liberalism, that we're living in and among, but has certainly not failed to think very deeply and in many ways sharply about it. So again, one can rattle off names, but the fact that it doesn't filter up into the media hardly seems to me to justify it, to say that it doesn't exist. So I guess I'm curious in how you would answer my colleague in the yellow shirt, the mustard shirt, I would say.
Right, did you?
Actually, I thought I heard two different questions. Aaron, I think, was saying, what's the point of doing this stuff if it doesn't ever make any real impact, not just in media, but actually in the real world of decisions, right? Is that what you're saying? That it's all very well for people like me or whoever to write our pieces, but the world still continues to turn. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah.
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 Why? Yeah, I can't figure it out. I'm sitting here thinking, how come Francois Hollande can say, we're going to put up taxes for the rich? There's such a thing, and it can be part of the mainstream debate. Or you can have the debate in Greece. Whatever, it's there. But that debate, moving out of it, your diagnosis, I think, is quite right at the political spectrum. The two ends, I think that sums it up very well. But why can't something more radical enter into that space?
Right, okay. And then your question was really that academics do an awful lot of stuff in neoliberalism, but no one ever pays attention. People like me never pay any attention. That's basically what you were saying, I think. And I think they're different things. The easier one to deal with, I think, is your question about academics and academic output. yes, academics have done stuff on the financial crisis, CRESC, but Ireland as well. A lot, I can name. Obviously, we could list names. But where I do sort of differ from you is I don't think talking about neoliberalism quite does it for me. Talking about a system in the round as opposed to talking about a specific crisis, which is to do with people in, this new class of, or a relatively new class of capitalists, whose new position within our society, within our economics, within our politics, why there wasn't significant diagnosis of them before the crisis. And there really wasn't. I went back and looked through the mainstream journals. There wasn't that much. So if you want to talk about did sociologists do an awful lot of neoliberalism, yeah, I'm sure they did. But I think you need to combine that sense of kind of a general diagnosis of what's wrong with kind of specific points. Where is this going wrong and how is it going wrong? And it's not just about sociologists or political theorists, political scientists too. Political Studies Association haven't done, people within there haven't done an awful lot on how this is played out either. The point about what difference does it make, I wouldn't overestimate how little or how marginal the people, the names that you've mentioned, whether it's Will Hutton, Will Hutton is one economics commentator on The Observer. There is also a whole bunch of political commentators. The Observer is only one newspaper, obviously. The majority of the people will still continue talking in terms of cuts or no cuts, Osborne up, down, sideways, whichever. That's still the level of debate. You need an awful lot more of that, and it needs to keep going, it needs to come from lots and lots of different sides. But the one thing I will say is, these changes in discourse, they do end up having some kind of political impact, sometimes very quickly. The really obvious example of that is, well, you've had two really obvious examples in the past couple of years. One was the student protests, where you saw political classes actually get quite worried. People in government get quite worried because here are the children of people who they assumed had voted for them, and they're out on the streets protesting about tuition fees. And the second thing is obviously Occupy. The Occupy movement, I think, has actually liberated some parts of the Labour left to start talking about these issues again. But it's also set kind of boundaries upon what's acceptable for David Cameron to say as well. Or it did for a time. Whether that continues depends on how successful those sorts of movements continue to be.
Hi, I'm a filmmaker from Germany. I only deal with a small section of the financial industry called microfinance, but I think I have fairly strong reasons to say there are a lot of things wrong with it, and I have tried over the past couple of years to write numerous articles in newspapers about it. But I don't think I'm very shy about my views. I think I have good arguments which I presented to editors. The two articles which I've been able to publish have been with newspapers whose editors I personally knew. And from others I've got the report back saying, we can't print that, or no reports at all. It may be my views, but it may also be my hypothesis, which is that the media have this structural risk aversion about reporting unorthodox views outside the norm, and that they are basically afraid of offending people with minority or innovative views instead of reproducing the same old ones. So I wonder what you would.
I think that's absolutely. I think that's balls, actually. I actually one of the really interesting things about the economic crisis is how much space it's opened up for people who are, notionally economic journalists to bring in people from outside economics. Paul Mason, who would have been here, is an obvious example of that. Gillian Tett, Will Hutton, Larry Elliott, all of these sorts of people do reach out for. There aren't an awful lot of, I'd agree with you there, which I think goes back to Aaron's point, but I don't think that there's a kind of thing where people are really, scared of offending people, especially in the case of microfinance. There's a big problem with microfinance, which is it's, a pretty small part of the economic system, and it relates mainly to third world countries.
One plain response to that, which is that any day you open a newspaper in the UK or Germany, you'll find a positive story about microfinance, which has basically been researched off the internet.
Really? I mean, I look at my Guardian today, I didn't see one. I mean, I don't know. I'm not so sure that we write that much about microfinance one way or the other.
Can one come at this question in terms of supply and demand? I mean, one of the things that really strikes me is that the academics are overwhelmingly these days writing for other academics. I mean, if you look at CRESC website, for example, the reason people go to it is that there's lots of stuff on it which is written for non-academic audiences. Clearly, the whole, I mean, that to begin with requires a team of people to do it, because it would be suicide in ref terms for an individual to write as much, which was not referable as the CRESC team does. But isn't there something also about the kind of the individualization, the form of publication in peer-reviewed journals and all the rest of that kind of business, which, is almost a kind of limit on academic supply of the stuff that you want to actually have?
You're completely right. I mean, CRESC not only writes stuff for non-academic audiences, but they also bring in people from outside academia to work on work. Peter down the front, has been on writing your reports on private equity. As well, I mean, you mentioned that I write for The Guardian, but the other thing that I do that you also are involved in is I sort of have a small group of economists and non-economists who meet at The Guardian once a month and talk about these sorts of issues to do with the crisis, Eurozone, Britain, China, and so on and so forth. And one of the things I noticed, and that's not something that a newspaper normally does. So actually it took a fair amount of lobbying to get the resources to hold these sorts of things at The Guardian. And the way that modern institutions work, you now have to sign a form, which means you have a security guard extra who waits on the door, despite the fact you're only talking about 20 academics turning up, but he's there in case there's any trouble. And there's always this, I mean, Will Davis will attest, there's always this ridiculous canapes that are laid on for people as well, which has always struck me. Very intricate quiches who turn up. But what really strikes me about that is the people who turned up would normally say that these sorts of meetings, even not talking about output, but just meetings, would no longer happen within their universities. And that really worries me. So it's not just we have to produce output, because we all have to produce output, and there is a problem on all sides in that we end up therefore having quite splintered discourses. But there's also a problem that there isn't a kind of desire to combine going on, whether at an academic level or within a media organisation. Because certainly I'm not aware of journalists who get together and talk about these things either.
And there, I think I was told we. Let me get one from Nick, because that is an NGO point of view, and I think it would be very useful to have that. Last question.
Not an NGO point of view, my point.
Your point of view, right.
I'm just slightly puzzled by the premise, actually, of the discussion. I mean, from where I'm coming from, what makes anybody think that the press, or NGOs, or academics should be at the vanguard of a radical reappraisal of society? I mean, you went back before the crisis, the press was largely captured. It had a few tame radicals in it, George Monbiot and a few others, and none knew. High trained, but coming out once a week or whatever. But I mean, the coverage was absolutely mainstream, uncritical. Few academics, you've still got them. I mean, Krugman's having a heyday. What's so radical about him? What's radical about Keynes? And as for the NGOs, I mean, the mainstream NGOs have not done anything radical for a long, long time, believe me. I mean, you talked about 2005 being a great success. Actually, from a radical NGO perspective, whatever it was called, the end of poverty, made poverty history, was a disaster, an absolute disaster. It was the absolute containment of a lot of development NGOs. So you know, I'm puzzled. I'm really, really puzzled as to why anybody should think that suddenly these three institutions, which should have become radicalized and changed into the vanguard of a new revolution overnight, when really the more interesting question, I think, is why have the radical elements, a radical alternative, why has it proved so difficult to organize successfully for change? Because, I mean, it's not as if some NGOs aren't doing very well. Migration Watch, unfortunately, is doing extremely well. The Derivatives Association is doing very well, thank you. You know, there are a lot of NGOs out there that are doing fine. I mean, why this curious idea that NGOs are all goodies?
I don't think anyone said that, did they?
There's an assumption right the way through
No,
the whole
there was
discourse.
no such assumption.
No, well, I mean, I would have said that there's an assumption that they will be on, NGOs will be on the side of radical change. And actually, NGOs is a vast spectrum.
Yes.
And
Covering lots of issues, as you said.
yeah.
But I mean...
Not just covering a lot of issues, coming from a lot of different perspectives.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
As with newspapers, as with universities, as with academics. I mean, I don't think anyone is seriously trying to put forward an idea that there were unitary bodies.
Why should the relatively marginalised elements within the universities, within the media, within the NGOs, who may have a more radical perspective, why have they failed to organise successfully in response to that crisis? And that seems to me a very different conversation to what's happening in the Labour Party or the Conservatives or whatever.
Except that if you just want groups of people who are all sort of happily confirmed in their radicalism to get together, that's great. But if you want some kind of change to result from these discussions and from these ideas, then you have to start thinking about where your vehicles are. The point about the media isn't that it's going to be radicalised and that you get journalists who all of a sudden, start hanging out in Zuccotti Park or, outside St. Paul's. The point is that it will reflect, to some degree, imperfectly, and sometimes not fairly, well, often not fairly, but it will reflect sort of wider discourses. And the question is, are those discourses going on? To what extent are they serious, significant, and dealing with kind of issues that I'm particularly interested in talking about? I'm not, I'm talking about a particular thing, the financial crisis. There are lots of other issues you could talk about. And to what extent do you have a window which is open to people to use? And I mean in terms of time, because I think 4 or 5 years on from the crisis, it's already palpable that people are bored of talking about the crisis. It's palpable that people are bored of reading about the Eurozone crisis, despite the fact that what's going on there is utterly terrifying. But, have you noticed it on the front of newspapers recently? It's not on there.
Right. At that point, I think we should thank Aditya and give him a round of applause.